Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who demands the keys to my property. I never imagined that something as simple as a backyard pond could lead to a full-blown neighborhood spectacle, complete with police intervention and exasperating demands. But here I am, recounting one of the strangest experiences of my life, all because a neighbor named Karen decided she wanted unsupervised access to my property in order to swim at dawn. It's remarkable how a simple "No, I'm not comfortable handing over my keys" could explode into an all-out battle of wills. Before I get into the dramatic parts, let me explain a bit about my backyard setup. Many years ago, I bought this house precisely because the land behind it was vast and had a small, spring-fed pond. Over time, I put in considerable work to transform it into a tranquil retreat. I planted willows along the banks, positioned some large stepping stones around the perimeter, and even introduced a few ornamental fish, though I primarily just loved having a peaceful water feature in my yard. My ultimate goal was to have a private space where I could unwind after work or host a few friends on weekends. It was never intended to be a public swimming hole for the entire neighborhood. When I first moved in, there was an existing fence around the property and a couple of gates. I had no reason to change anything about the fencing at the time because I felt it was adequately protecting the yard. Once in a while, neighbors would ask if they could take a look at the pond, or maybe host a small afternoon gathering near it. Sometimes people who didn't have big yards of their own just wanted a pleasant spot for kids to feed fish or admire the water. I'm no grouch, so I always tried to be accommodating. If I was home and my schedule allowed it, I had no problem letting folks come by for a bit, under my supervision. After all, I love the sound of children laughing and I enjoy being a good neighbor. I never had a negative experience with that arrangement until Karen moved in down the street. I remember the first day she showed up at my door wearing bright pink leggings and a sun visor, tapping her foot on my welcome mat as if she were in a rush. She introduced herself brusquely, said she had heard about my lovely pond, and added that she was an avid swimmer. Admittedly, that was my first red flag, calling herself an avid swimmer when it was obvious I wasn't running a public pool, but rather a rustic backyard pond with a bit of a wild ecosystem. She all but demanded I let her take a few morning laps in it. I was so caught off guard that all I managed to say was, "I don't usually let people swim there unless I'm around. I might be okay with you coming by on weekend afternoons when I'm gardening, but early morning laps sound like a liability nightmare." I tried to keep my tone polite, but Karen's expression was a mixture of confusion and condescension, as if she couldn't believe someone might dare set restrictions on her. In the weeks that followed, she made repeated requests, each time stepping up her sense of entitlement. She came armed with an odd set of arguments: that she needed morning exercise for her health, that she should be granted the freedom to swim because the city pool hours were too restrictive, that she was respectable enough to handle keys to my gates, and on and on. I tried to meet her halfway. I explained, with all the kindness I could muster, that the pond wasn't even that large, that I had fish in there, and that morning swims would disturb my rest. Beyond that, I simply wasn't comfortable handing a key to someone I barely knew. Karen seemed to interpret my reluctance as a personal attack. She would ring my doorbell at odd times, repeating the same demands over and over, occasionally saying things like, "If you trusted me, you would see how generous I can be," or "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." Her tone made me uneasy. The part about her being generous sounded suspicious, as if she believed she could buy access if I named my price, but I value my privacy. No dollar amount could make me hand over my property's keys to a stranger. About a month into this ongoing tension, Karen started going around our neighborhood telling people I was unneighborly, maybe even paranoid. She told a few folks that I was a control freak because I insisted on personally supervising anyone who used my pond. Some neighbors who knew me well brushed it off and didn't give her rumors much mind. Others, who were more on the periphery of our street's social circle, raised curious eyebrows and started asking me if I was feuding with the new lady. I tried to diffuse the situation, saying there was no feud, just a difference in boundaries. Usually folks would shrug and say, "That sounds like Karen is overreacting," or "You're within your rights, it's your property." Still, a sense of worry settled in the pit of my stomach. I had seen enough reality TV drama to know that some people don't let go easily, especially when they carry themselves like they can do no wrong. One weekend, I decided to relax in the backyard with a couple of close friends. We had a small barbecue going, and while we were chatting, I noticed Karen peering through the fence. She was craning her neck, possibly trying to see if the yard was filled with swimmers. My best friend Tessa joked, "Looks like you've got a self-appointed lifeguard checking in on us." We all kind of laughed, but inside, I was uneasy. I didn't like the feeling of being watched in my own yard. It was one thing for a curious neighbor to glance over, but Karen's stance was so intense that it felt invasive. Over the course of the afternoon, every now and then I would catch a glimpse of her blonde hair bobbing along the fence line, seemingly searching for a vantage point into my backyard. The moment my friends left that evening, I got a tap on the gate. Sure enough, it was Karen, bold as ever. She started with some small talk about the fish in the pond, then smoothly pivoted to her main request. "I noticed you had guests enjoying your yard. You're obviously okay with letting people in. So how about you finally hand me those keys so I can come in when you're not busy?" I told her calmly that I only host close friends who I trust implicitly. It wasn't as if I gave random acquaintances free access, and certainly not a neighbor I barely knew. Her face darkened. She forced a smile, muttered something about how she'd just have to find an alternative if I insisted on being selfish, and stomped away. A chill ran up my spine. That encounter confirmed for me that she felt entitled to something that was clearly not hers, and that she might attempt some alternative method of getting into my property. True to my gut feeling, about a week later, I woke up one morning to an alert from my backyard camera system. I had installed a few cameras facing the gates and along the path to the pond purely for security. The alarm indicated movement near the gate at around 5 in the morning. That was an unusual hour for anyone to be poking around. Through the app on my phone, I saw a brief, grainy clip of someone jiggling the lock to my gate. They didn't get in, but it was pretty startling to know that someone was testing my lock that early in the day. I couldn't see the person's face clearly, just a silhouette, but my suspicions instantly turned to Karen. Nobody else had made an issue about wanting to be in my yard in the early hours. At that point, I felt it was prudent to add a deadbolt to the gate and reinforce my doors leading to the back. I even added an additional motion sensor near the path. Part of me felt like I was going overboard, but better safe than sorry. My next step was to talk to one of my neighbors, Jonas, who lived across the street and had become a friend I could rely on. Jonas was a retired contractor who knew a thing or two about property boundaries and security measures. When I explained the situation, he shook his head in disbelief. "That's a big warning sign," he said. "Don't wait until she does something more drastic. You might want to think about letting the local authorities know someone jiggled your lock." I took his advice seriously. I wasn't quite at the point of filing a police report, but I did call a non-emergency line and explained that someone had attempted to access my yard early in the morning. They noted my concerns and told me to call if anything else happened or if I got more concrete evidence of trespassing. That made me feel slightly better. At least I was on record, trying to protect my property. Then came the call to 911. But it wasn't my call, it was Karen's. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I had just woken up around 7 and was leisurely getting ready for work. Out of nowhere, I heard loud knocking at the door and was startled by the presence of a police officer speaking through the front window. I opened the door, and there stood not one but 2 officers, looking somewhat puzzled themselves. They asked me if there was a medical emergency or an ongoing threat here. Confused, I said no. That's when Karen appeared on my front walkway, putting on a performance worthy of a daytime drama series. She told the officers that I was refusing her access to a water source she needed for health reasons, and that she feared I was purposely trying to block her from a vital resource. She framed her complaint as if I were hoarding the only water supply in our area, which was utterly ridiculous. One of the officers looked at her like she had just claimed to have flown in from the moon. The lead officer then asked her clarifying questions. "Is this man's pond on his private property?" "Yes," Karen admitted. "Has he threatened you in any way or told you he would harm you?" "Well, no," she conceded. "Has he locked you out of an area that you previously had a legal right to access?" "Well, no, but," she started, before going off on a tangent about how I was uncooperative and unfair. The officers looked completely unimpressed. One politely informed Karen that this was a misuse of 911 resources. "911 is for emergencies," the officer said. "It sounds like you're having a dispute over private property. If you believe he's violating any civil agreement, you'd have to pursue that in civil court. But from the sound of it, he's under no obligation to hand you keys." Karen protested, trying to spin her story in multiple ways. She even said something along the lines of, "But I was worried for my safety because he has a pond, and there's water, and I might need to access it." The officers exchanged glances. recognizing that she was grasping at straws. Finally, they told her she could be cited for making a frivolous emergency call. That's when her theatrical aggression turned into stunned silence. After the police left, I politely asked Karen never to do something like that again, because calling 911 over a non-emergency dispute could endanger someone who actually needed urgent help. My heart was still pounding from the confusion and adrenaline rush of having uniformed officers on my doorstep for no valid reason. Karen just harumphed, turned her back, and walked away in a huff. I assumed that the embarrassment of that moment would convince Karen to back off, but I underestimated her determination. A few days later, I started receiving bizarre notes slid under my door and wedged into the mailbox. They were typed on a computer, likely so I wouldn't recognize her handwriting. The messages read like a legal notice from some made-up entity claiming that I was required to give neighbors fair use of my yard and pond under a fictional community rule. The language was barely coherent, referencing statutes that didn't exist, citing laws from random places with no bearing on our actual state. It was borderline laughable if it wasn't also a bit chilling. The nerve of someone to fabricate legalese to intimidate me into giving up my property rights was astounding. At that point, I decided to gather all the evidence: the camera footage of the lock jiggling, the notes, and a timeline of Karen's demands and her 911 call. I took all of it to the local police station. The officer at the desk recognized me from the earlier call and was immediately sympathetic, though he stressed that everything Karen had done so far was right on the line. Odd behavior, yes, but not quite enough to get a restraining order unless I felt threatened or she trespassed in a more direct manner. Still, it was good to document everything. He recommended that I install visible private property signs around my gates and add a no trespassing sign near the pond area. This way, if Karen ever trespassed, I would have a stronger legal footing. So that's what I did. I even placed a small sign by the pond that read, "Swim at your own risk. Unauthorized access forbidden." I knew it might seem over the top, but if Karen insisted on ignoring my boundaries, I wanted an ironclad way to hold her accountable. Friends asked me if I thought she'd actually try to break in. I truly didn't know. People in my town mostly got along, and while I dealt with petty gossip, I'd never had someone so aggressively push to invade my space. Then came the day Karen finally crossed the line. It was a Saturday, early afternoon, and I was out running errands. I typically close all my gates with padlocks when I leave the house, especially after the lock jiggling incident. But I must have been in a bit of a rush that morning because I forgot to lock the side gate that's closer to the garden shed. That gate usually remains locked except for when the landscapers or I need to bring equipment in and out. Unfortunately, I left it only latched, not secured, and that's all Karen needed. When I returned home, I noticed something was off. The side gate was slightly ajar. My stomach lurched. I stepped into the backyard carefully, scanning the area. That's when I heard the splashing. Sure enough, Karen was in my pond wearing a bright red swimsuit and swimming around with a smug look of triumph. I was absolutely livid, but also astounded by the sheer audacity. She must have realized her advantage because I wasn't there and the gate was unlatched. To make matters worse, she was accompanied by another neighbor's daughter, a teenage girl who looked uncertain and embarrassed to be there. The scene might have been comical if it weren't such a violation of my privacy. Karen turned and waved at me like she was greeting a friend at a pool party, calling out, "Hey there, hope you don't mind. Figured you wouldn't since you're usually so nice about letting people enjoy the pond." That was the final straw. I told her to get out immediately. She tried to stall, splashing a bit and saying, "Oh, come on, don't be such a spoil sport," as if I were the one being unreasonable. The teenage girl hurriedly climbed out of the water, mumbling an apology and looking like she wanted to disappear. Karen stayed in, brazenly ignoring my demand. I grabbed my phone and told her if she didn't leave in the next minute, I would call the police. She had the nerve to laugh and say, "Go ahead. I'm sure they'd love to hear from me again." Perhaps she thought I wouldn't dare. Wrong. I dialed. The dispatch operator recognized my address and calmly assured me someone would be on the way. When Karen realized I wasn't bluffing, she clambered out of the water. She tried to hustle herself and the teenager toward the gate, but I stood in front of it, blocking her. I wanted to ensure the police would have a chance to see exactly what she had done. I wasn't about to risk her spinning another fictional story, claiming I'd given her permission again. Within about 10 minutes, a patrol car pulled up. I led the officers to the backyard, where they found Karen dripping wet, her face flushed with equal parts embarrassment and anger. The officers asked what happened. I stated clearly that she had trespassed onto my private property, broken into my secured yard. Even though that gate was technically just latched, not locked, it was still a barrier, and used my pond without permission. I also mentioned that this was part of an ongoing harassment situation. Karen tried to argue that I had always let neighbors use the pond, so she believed it was open for community use. The officers didn't buy it. They could plainly see my signs, and I produced my phone with images showing the gate typically locked. I also pointed out the newly posted "No Trespassing" signs. The officer I had spoken to previously was on duty. He remembered Karen calling 911. His patience for her excuses had clearly run thin. He explained to her in no uncertain terms that she was trespassing on private property, that she had no legal right to enter without the owner's explicit consent, and that calling 911 for such a petty personal dispute was considered a misuse of emergency services. Karen stammered, trying to salvage her dignity. She even tried shifting the blame onto the teenage girl, claiming that the girl wanted to see the fish and had told Karen that I would be okay with it. The girl, who was shivering in a towel, just stared at the ground and muttered that she had only come along because Karen said it was permissible. That day, the police gave Karen a choice: leave now and accept a trespassing citation, or continue arguing and risk a more severe response. She chose to leave, but she didn't go quietly. She spat out something about me being the most selfish neighbor on the planet, and how I would never have peace now that I had deliberately humiliated her in front of a kid. I had a feeling that none of the threats she spewed could make her look like the aggrieved party, given the blatant disregard for my property rights. The officer handed her a ticket for trespassing. It wasn't a major offense, but enough to put her on record. In the days after that incident, things got both calmer and tenser in a strange way. Karen seemed to keep her distance, obviously humiliated that her plan to use my yard as her personal swimming hole had backfired so spectacularly. At the same time, I noticed that she tried to recruit a couple of neighbors to her side by telling them contrived sob stories about how I had led her on, claiming she was welcome any time, then suddenly turned on her without warning. Fortunately, most of my neighbors who know me well didn't buy it. One neighbor, Stella, told me that Karen dropped by to rant, and Stella basically told her, "He can do whatever he wants with his property. You had no right to barge in." Karen retreated quickly after that. One of the subplots that arose from all this madness was the effect on the neighborhood's teen hangouts. The teenage girl who had been with Karen in the pond came by a couple of weeks later, accompanied by her older brother. They knocked on my door to apologize for trespassing and explained they had followed Karen because she acted like she had my express permission. The brother looked mortified that she had been dragged into such a situation, and I believed them. I accepted the apology. I could see that they were basically pawns in Karen's scheme. I told them politely that if they ever wanted to respectfully view the pond in the future, all they had to do was ask me directly, and if I was home and comfortable with it, I wouldn't mind letting them sit on the bank or feed the fish for a few minutes. They seemed relieved and promised never to repeat the mistake. In that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was good to see that not everyone was so easily taken in by Karen's nonsense once they realized the facts. Shortly after, I found myself dealing with yet another surprise. Karen tried to file a complaint with our city's code enforcement office, claiming that my pond was some sort of hazard or environmental risk. My first inkling of this was a letter in the mail from the local regulatory department, requesting permission for an inspection. Apparently, they had received an anonymous tip that my pond might be polluting the groundwater. I had a strong hunch who the anonymous tipster was. In any case, I allowed the inspector to visit. He did a quick assessment and found absolutely nothing out of order. The water was clean enough, the fish were healthy, and my landscaping was well maintained. The inspector left, stating there was no violation. Another one of Karen's attempts to stir trouble had fallen flat. On the heels of this code enforcement fiasco, Karen decided to pay me one more unwelcome visit. She showed up at my door one late afternoon, looking somewhat contrite, but I could tell there was still a hard edge behind her eyes. She said she wanted to clear the air and offered a half-hearted apology. Then she slipped right back into the same demands. So now that I've recognized I should have asked more politely, "Can we discuss having a copy of your gate keys for my personal use?" I nearly laughed. She just didn't get it. There was no scenario in any universe where I would ever give her unsupervised access to my pond after all the stunts she'd pulled. I told her, "I'm sorry, Karen, but under no circumstances will I provide you with a key." I must have still sounded polite, though I was burning with exasperation inside. She pressed on, suggesting that I have a lawyer draft a liability waiver so she could sign it, presumably to free me from any responsibility if she slipped and got hurt. She tried to spin it like I'd have nothing to lose if she swam unsupervised, but it was never just about liability. It was about trust, privacy, and not wanting a neighbor rummaging around my yard at sunrise. I told her that even if she signed 100 liability waivers, I wasn't comfortable with her being on my property uninvited. She glowered at me, muttering that I was letting my paranoia ruin what could have been a nice arrangement. I responded by reminding her that she had already trespassed, tried to break in at 5 in the morning, and called 911 falsely. She had run out of good faith a long time ago. She gave me one final glare and walked away. Since then, she hasn't tried to barge in, at least not to my knowledge. Yet the story didn't fully end there. A few weeks later, Karen received a summons to court, not from me, but from the local authorities. Apparently, calling 911 under false pretenses doesn't simply vanish after a single scolding. The city decided to move forward with charging her for misuse of emergency services, presumably because she had lied in her call about there being an immediate threat, just to get the police to come. The officers had my statement about the day they arrived and found that she had called them for no legitimate reason. Karen tried to talk her way out of it, but ultimately she was slapped with a fine and had to pay some court fees. It wasn't a massive punishment, but it was enough to serve as a wake-up call that her antics could carry real consequences. The aftermath of that hearing rippled through the neighborhood. People whispered about Karen being the one who misused 911, and a few folks approached me asking, "Did she really do all that just for your pond?" I'd respond with a wry smile, "You'd be surprised what some people think they're entitled to." Even her initial supporters, who had listened sympathetically to her stories about me being unfair, now saw the bigger picture. They realized she'd gone to outrageous lengths to bend reality to her whim. Karen's reputation in the neighborhood tanked. She became that neighbor, the one everyone knew was best to avoid. Some folks told me they'd been cornered by her with odd requests or unsolicited complaints about others. It turned out I wasn't the only target of her pushy behavior. Eventually, Karen's house went on the market. I'm not sure if she felt too uncomfortable to stay, or if she was just one of those people who hop from one place to another whenever tensions rise. She didn't hold a big farewell party or anything. I doubt anyone would have attended if she had. One day, I just noticed a for sale sign. Within a couple of months, she was gone. The day the moving truck pulled away was the first time in almost a year that I felt I could fully exhale. Her meltdown over my pond had affected my stress levels, my relationships with neighbors, and the overall vibe of our street. While she was packing up, I did catch one final glimpse of her. She was on the sidewalk, conferring with her real estate agent, both of them pointing at the exterior of her home. She looked my way, but we didn't speak. She gave me a little nod, not quite an apology, but maybe an acknowledgement of defeat. I responded with a polite nod. I didn't hold a personal grudge that I wanted to nurse forever, but I also couldn't pretend that her behavior had been anything but a nightmare. In the time since Karen left, my pond has reverted to the peaceful sanctuary I always wanted it to be. The fish are healthy, I've added a few new lily pads, and I even built a small deck extension so I can relax by the water in the evenings. I still occasionally let neighbors stop by, but only when I'm there, and only after they ask politely. The sense of control over my own property is reassuring. I no longer worry about waking up to find an unwanted swimmer at dawn. There was one more subplot that turned out to be a silver lining. Throughout my ordeal with Karen, I developed a much closer relationship with Jonas, the retired contractor across the street, and also connected with a couple of other neighbors who offered their support. Now we host small neighborhood gatherings in a more official capacity, almost like a block party system. We chat about issues openly, share news about events in town, and look out for each other. Ironically, Karen's attempt to alienate me from the neighborhood had the opposite effect. It pulled me closer to the community. People realized that I was easygoing and that I only put my foot down when boundaries were blatantly crossed. Another positive outcome is that I installed some additional security measures I might not have considered if Karen's intrusion hadn't happened. Now, there's a better lighting system along the fence line and clearer signage. I had an electrician friend set up motion-activated lights. We joked that it was my Karen defense system, but in reality, It just made sense to have well-lit gates for safety and deterrence. Since adding these lights, I've had zero incidents of anyone even touching my gates uninvited. I also learned a lot about my rights as a property owner. Before Karen, I had always been somewhat vague about the exact laws concerning trespassing, liabilities, and false emergency calls. This entire fiasco forced me to educate myself. It taught me how vital it is to keep documentation of harassment or suspicious incidents. Without my camera footage and the logs of phone calls, I might have faced an uphill battle proving that Karen's intrusion was more than just a misunderstanding. Now I feel equipped to handle such scenarios should they ever arise again. I sincerely hope they don't, but knowledge is power. As for Karen's ultimate punishment, I think the combination of the citation for trespassing, the fine for misusing 911, and the tarnished reputation was enough to make her think twice about trying stunts like that in the future. Some might argue she deserved more, but I didn't want to dwell on vengeance. My main goal was simply to protect my privacy. I believe she learned a valuable lesson about crossing boundaries and that there are real consequences for such behavior. Legally, socially, and financially. From start to finish, this saga taught me the importance of setting clear boundaries and standing firm once I've defined them. I'm proud of the way I handled myself. I never resorted to insults or aggression, just persistent documentation and calm cooperation with law enforcement. If I had caved in once, if I had even pretended to give Karen a key, I can't imagine the chaos that would have followed. Allowing someone who has no respect for personal space to have free access to your property is a recipe for disaster. I dodged a major bullet by sticking to my instincts. Friends, thank you. See you soon.